Kia ora tātou, nau mai haere mai, and warm welcome to everybody this morning for our council deliberations around our long-term plan for Wednesday the 29th of May 2024. And before we get into things, if I could ask Councillor Fitzgerald to open with karakia. Councillor.
Alright, tēnā koe te rangati te kāhika, Mayor Grant Smith koutou, ngā kai kaunihere, me ngā kai mahi. Huri no ki a tātou i te whare, me ngā koutou kanu i te matanui, tēnā tātou mei karakia tātou. Tū taua mai i runga, tū taua mai i raro, tū taua mai i roto, tū taua mai i waho. Kia tau ai, te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te katoa, haumie, huie, tākie.
Kia ora, thank you. All right, in terms of our health and safety, we'll just, in the unlikely event of an emergency, we will leave on hearing the alarm to the site by the nearest fire exit and the green signs that you entered in. We'll evacuate to the assembly area, which is the clock tower down in the square Te Maraahine. Our toilets are in the Linkspan area as you arrived. In terms of smoking and vaping, it's prohibited within the building. And a defibrillator, again, unlike the event of needing one, is located in the entrance at the customer services on the ground floor. Any incidents, please report them to our committee administration. We have, if I could just ask staff in the first instance, please, if you're answering any questions or commenting, maybe your name and title in the first instance for those online. And this morning we have Councillor Billy Meehan online, and we will look to our apologies, and that we receive apologies from the Deputy Mayor for lateness. I'm happy to move those, seconded by, thank you, Councillor Hancock. There being no commentary, we'll vote, please. And that has passed, 14 votes and none against. Okay, we will move through to notification of additional item, and there is one, and it is around the submission to the Parliamentary Select Committee around Māori wards. And look, the reason for the lateness was that it was only introduced into Parliament. The bill was only introduced on Thursday the 23rd of May, and submissions, reason for urgency is submissions close to the bill on Wednesday the 29th of May, today. So we have the paper there. I'd like to move that we receive that paper. If I could have a seconder, thank you, Councillor Johnson. If there's no commentary, I'll ask you to vote, please. It's passed, 13 votes for, none against. All right, we'll move through to declarations of interest. I haven't received anything. We'll move on. We now need to look at standing orders and moving option C. I'll get that back down. Okay, just one moment. Okay, this is a recommendation that Council adopt option C, which is under our standing orders 2.12.3 for the duration of the meeting. Just allows a free and multiple opportunities to speak. So I'm happy to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Being no commentary, we will vote, please. And that has passed 16 votes for and none against. Thank you. Number 5 on our order paper is public comment, and I haven't received any. There's nothing from the floor. All right, we'll move through to our confirmation of minutes of the 15th of May 2024. And that the minutes of the ordinary meeting, the 15th of May 2024, Part 1 public, be confirmed as a true and correct record. I'm happy to move that. Seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Are there any matters arising? There being none, I'll ask you to vote. And that has passed 15 votes for with 1 abstention. Okay, we'll move through to number 7 on our order, which is around the notice of motion, an alteration of fees and charges for the impounding of animals. And that's from Councillor Wood. But before we go there, Councillor, we'll just look to take the officer's response first. And Rebecca Adamson, Rebecca and Ross, welcome. This is on page 39, councillors.
Kia ora koutou, Rebecca Adamson, Acting Environmental Protection Services Manager, alongside Ross McDermott, Team Leader, Animal Management and Education. Through the Chair, information has been provided in response to the notice of motion. I'd like to highlight 2 points. Firstly, the adoption figures are based on an average of 40 dogs per year. A portion of these dogs are managed by other agencies. Secondly, I wish to reconfirm the adoption fee includes vaccination, worming, flea treatment, microchipping and desexing, which was an average cost of $311 over the dogs we directly rehomed over the last 3 years. The desexing costs rise significantly based on the weight of the female dog. Therefore, larger female dogs may be disadvantaged from adoption if a sliding scale were to be implemented. We're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. Ross, anything to add from you?
No, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, team. Just to confirm whether or not first-year registrations included as part of the adoption fees.
Through the Chair, this year we have included the first year of registration in the original fee of the $559.
And so just to confirm your understanding of this notice of motion is that would also be included at whatever rate that we decide on today.
Yeah. I think through the submissions and your notice of motion, I guess the suggestion was that that was taken off and included in the adoption fee. So not, yeah. Does that make sense and answer your question?
I think so, yes. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Ross and Tim. Just to confirm that the suggested figure of $250 wouldn't actually cover the average cost per dog.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. I did put in a question to officers prior to the meeting and after the submission. I'm just going to ask it again now so it's on the record. Have you got any evidence that the level of the adoption fee has dissuaded anyone from adopting a dog? Or have you had feedback from people wanting to adopt a dog that they wouldn't be able to do it once they found out what the fee was?
Again, through the Chair, we don't have any actual evidence or recorded evidence of that. That said, in speaking with the animal management team, we don't recall any case where someone has chosen not to adopt a dog purely because of cost.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just to clarify, when we put the fee up to $559 a few months ago, is my memory correct that that was just to recover costs only, or is there any margin on that?
Well, the intention behind putting the fee up was we were getting feedback from customers that they would look online or contact us for the fees for the dogs, and we were saying the fee for rehoming is $400, and then registration was on top. So it was getting quite confusing for customers. So we chose to insert the registration fee and set it at one fixed fee.
Oh, thank you. And so can you just remind me how much the registration fee component is?
For the next financial year, it will be $131.
So thank you. Just back to the original question. So the complete cost, including the registration fee, is that just cost recovery, or is there additional margin on that?
We looked for cost recovery, plus trying to cover off some of the time that the dog is kept in our care.
Oh, yeah.
Noting the average cost we've mentioned on page 42, 3.2 doesn't include that.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Arnott.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, bear with me. How many dogs are euthanised per year?
Right, I'll give you the figures for the last 3 years. So the 2020-21 year was 42, the 21-22 year was 59, and the 22-23 was 109.
109, good grief. How long are they kept in the shelter before being euthanised?
It's very dependent on the dog. We have a minimum hold period of 7 days. Where there's an owner known, it may be longer, and then we'll do assessments for rehoming and keep the dog for as long as we can to find it a home.
So is there a maximum amount of days that's kept in the shelter before it's put down?
Currently we don't have a fixed maximum.
Okay, but it could be up to, say, 3 months or?
Yes, or longer if need be.
Okay.
I would say by then we would be communicating with other agencies to try and home the dog there or through them.
Thank you. What does it cost to put a dog to sleep?
I haven't seen an invoice for that recently, so
Okay.
we can confirm that for you. Yeah.
Being on the front lines, have you got any views on the causing factor of why so many dogs aren't being adopted?
I think there's a general appeal for smaller breed dogs, giving housing density and the cost of actually keeping a dog. A lot of the dogs that are coming through our shelters are in the medium to large range, which makes it slightly more difficult for us to find homes for them. That said, I think we do well in finding homes for these dogs.
Thank you. Last question. How many, out of the 100 or so that were put down, how many were adoptable?
I would say none. Like I said before, we do behavioural assessments on dogs, and we're making sure that any dog we're putting back out into the community is safe for the family they're going to and other families and other animals in our community. There's a lot of discussion and assessment on animals before that decision's made.
So, sorry, just to clarify, so no dogs that were put down were able to be adopted. That's sort of what you just said. That's not right, surely. There were dogs put down that were able to be adoptable, but the homes couldn't be found.
No, so We won't put a dog back into the community that's showing signs of aggression or any risk to person or other animal. So all those assessments are done before the decision's made to euthanise a dog. We wouldn't euthanise a dog purely for the fact that we can't find it at home.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. That's questions. Councillor Mickelard, you were in the queue, you're not? Councillor Mickelard?
Oh, yes, Mr. Chair. Not sure if it's premature, but probably some of my questions have already been answered, but probably to the mover, probably asking in this setting, will the mover...
No, that'll come later.
Okay, cool.
We'll just get through the receiving the officers' advice. There's no more questions to the officers. Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you, Ross. Okay, so recommendation is that council receives the officer advice. I'm happy to move that. Seconded by, thank you, Councillor Dennison. And I'll now just open that up for any comments before we vote. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you to the mover and seconder for bringing this forward. I think it reflects the process that we're in, because this is a decision of council that would need to be changed in terms of the fees, the fee setting. I'm not comfortable with reducing from 5,559 to 250. I don't think we've got that right. I think the officer's report evidences that. I'd be looking to either seek the support of the mover and seconder, or to move an amendment that we move to $425, which was the amount suggested in the submission that we are seeking to respond to here, and I think does respond effectively to the compelling case that was made. And Councillor Johnson indicates she would second that if the mover and seconder aren't willing to go that far. Thanks.
Councillor Johnson. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to make a few comments, because I think it was a compelling submission, and it strongly indicated that perhaps we were a little bit out of line compared to other councils. So it did warrant a look at, and I'm grateful that we're doing that. Having said that, I think there are some factors here that perhaps haven't been considered. One is that not all dogs that come through the pound are rehomable. So just looking at the figures for the numbers of animals that are euthanized doesn't tell you anything about whether or not those animals were not rehomed because of cost. And I think the officers confirmed that at the moment, euthanasia is only for those animals that could not be rehomed, mostly because of their temperament. So I suppose we have to be careful that we're not using an emotive argument here about animals being euthanized because people can't afford to adopt them. I'm happy to amend the fee to bring it a little more into line, but I think it absolutely must cover the costs. I'm sure I don't need to remind you that we have a brand new facility that animals are using at the moment. We need to make sure that we're not selling ourselves short in terms of the fees and charges. The other thing I think that's important to say is that owning a dog is an expensive responsibility. It's not just the adoption fee. It's feeding it, it's paying the vet's fee, it's paying the dog registration, it's paying for it to be boarded while you go away. There's a whole lot of expenses that come with owning a dog, and I do feel that if the adoption fee itself was what was stopping people from adopting a dog, then they possibly are not in a position financially to be able to own one. So I'm not convinced, for a number of reasons, that the adoption fee itself is a barrier to people adopting dogs. Having said that, I do think we should be in line with other councils, but we also need to cover our costs. So that's why I'm happy to support either an amendment or an alternative to a more reasonable figure that covers the first year's registration and the costs. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, we're just going to, there's no further comments. I'm happy to just move on. So we'll vote on the recommendation around receiving the officer's advice, please. That's 16 votes for, none against. Thank you. Okay, we now come to the notice of motion, and it's around the council resolves to substitute the dog adoption fee from $559, including desexing, registration, flea and worming and microchipping, to instead of a fee of $250, noting the remainder of the fees set out in Appendix 6, Attachment A, will remain unchanged. And that's from Councillor Wood, second by Councillor Arnott. Councillor Wood, do you wish to speak to that?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And just before I get into my speech, to note that the seconder and I are more than happy to move the fee decrease from $250 to $311 in line with officer's advice, if that could be reflected in the recommendation, anticipating that there may be other amendments that come shortly afterwards. I want to start by thanking officers for responding to that so quickly. We appreciate the time pressure you're under, and we appreciate the environment we're in the LTP. So thank you very much for putting your report together to help us make this decision. I want to thank our submitter who brought this up and shared their passion in the chamber with us on this particular issue and gave us good, hard evidence of the fees that other councils are charging, which showed reasonably compellingly that we would be the highest, if not one of the highest, charges for dog adoption in the country if we were to go ahead with a fee of $559. I believe this is one of those issues that got caught up into the many fees that we made on that day. I certainly had no intention of disincentivising dog adoption through supporting those fees, and so I think it's great that this is a reflection of the submission process, that this has come through as an issue of particular importance and passion. I'm sorry to bring it this way as a notice of motion and sort of have it before the rest of the LTP deliberations we're going to have today. I would rather this was in the mix with everything else we were discussing, but at the end of the day, that's the advice on how best in the process we have to go through to make this change. So I want to make a few points. Firstly is that the cost of this is reasonably minor in terms of the scale of council's budgets that we're operating on today, and putting it up to $310, as officers have recommended in their report as a minimum cost, would help with some of that cost recovery, particularly including registration as one of those fees. I also want to note that it could be partially offset, because if a dog is adopted at an earlier date and doesn't have to be put down, then that reduces the cost of that dog staying in our accommodation. So there is a minor offset there, although I wouldn't want to purport what that would be. We've had advice in this chamber, and I recall last year when the report came through that 109 dogs had been euthanised, I asked specifically if any of those dogs could have been rehomed, and the answer was yes. I recall that distinctly in the chamber, and I'm sure many of us do. So that runs a little bit counter to what we've heard today, that some officers have said that, oh, the answer is no, none of them could have been rehomed. I mean, I guess it shouldn't be subjective, and my understanding was that that was the case, and so I'm working off the good information that we've had from our officers. But I completely agree with the argument that the higher we put the adoption fees, the less likely a person is to adopt a dog. And it's not a case, as was just put in the last comments, that, oh, well, if you can't afford the adoption fee, then you shouldn't really be able to afford a dog at all. It's a case that, well, potentially there are other places that people would go. If our adoption fee is $559 and MDC's is $300 and the SPCA's is, and I'm looking at it here in front of me right now, is $250 for a dog 5 months, 8 years, or $125 for a senior dog, the case of that the person might not be able to afford to own a dog at $559, it's the case that there are other places that they will go to do it. And so I don't believe that we should disadvantage our dogs in Palmerston North against the many other places a person could adopt from at that big a scale. And I appreciate that an amendment might come up to put it to $425, and although I won't support it, I'd rather it was $311. $425 would still be better than $559 as is proposed today. It includes year one registration. I think that's important to get people and our dogs off on the right step. And in terms of the data that we were asking officers for, have you had people come in and say, oh, I'd like to adopt a dog, but it's too high? Well, of course the answer is going to be no, because if you look at the website and you see the adoption fee is that price, you're not then going to come in and go, oh, well, actually, I can't afford it. You don't go to the shop to buy a bag you can't afford. You don't go to the pound to adopt a dog you can't afford. So we've got a survivorship bias in our statistics there that, of course, our data is not going to show. We've got hundreds of people walking through the door saying, wow, I wish I could adopt, but I can't afford it, because that's just not how people work. So I think, you know, of course the data would reflect that. $559 would make us one of the most expensive places to adopt in the country, and if the SPCA can do it for $250 plus a registration fee with council of $100 and whatever that figure was, which would bring it up more in line with what we're suggesting today, then I don't see any reason that we should encourage people not to adopt from us by putting our fees up to that price. So I appreciate you councillors bearing with me. I'm sorry this is the first thing we're debating today. I'm sure there are many other things we'd like to sink our teeth into, but I think it's important that we are able to have this discussion in the debate we're having today, and I certainly hope you'll support me, because any dog that is euthanised that could be rehomed is a tragedy and should not happen.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So to signal at the proper time, thank you for that, I'd like to move an amendment to 311 that becomes 425, and seconded by Councillor Johnson. I don't disagree with the points Councillor Wood has made. I just think we're not in a race to provide the cheapest dog adoption charges in the city. These are all Palmerston North dogs. They all need to find homes, whether that's through the SPCA, through private adoptions, through our own council facilities. I think we need to be sensible in where we set our fees and charges to recover the cost of providing this service, and to reflect the cost that council has put into our new facility and the need and the service that we provide, which is different to the services provided by other players in this market. So, yes, seeking your support for a move to 425 instead of 559. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'll just repeat some of the points that I made earlier. We have no evidence that the adoption fee is de-incentivising adoption. That's the first thing to say. And secondly, there won't be any saving on euthanasia, since rehomable dogs are not being euthanized. What I think it does is the submission drew our attention to where perhaps we were out of line with other councils, and I think it's reasonable to give that some consideration and to reduce the fee. However, having said that, I'm not happy to reduce the fee to less than what it actually costs us to provide the service. I mean, that's just a little bit too far, particularly on a day like today, where I'm quite sure that the councillor who's brought this notice of motion will be putting many savings in front of us. So I wouldn't want to start off and give the wrong impression. I'd like to be quite clear to everybody that I'm open to savings and to not making the council have to spend more money than it has to. So in that spirit, I would like to ask for your support to vote against this and to... we're doing the amendment. So to vote for the amendment at 425. Thank you.
Councillor Arnott.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now, you can't tell me that every dog euthanised isn't able to be adopted. You know, if you look on the council's Facebook page, every time there's a dog listed, it's scathing with people complaining about how expensive it is. And, you know, we've all probably had that special animal in our lives that we look back on fondly and remember the happiness and joy it brought us. And every time I see the council's Facebook page with dogs on it, my heart sinks. Because I know that probably there's a damn good chance that dog will be put down in a few weeks' time, euthanised because nobody comes forward to adopt it. And, you know, $559 is a heck of a lot of money, and probably a lot more than a lot of citizens in our city have hanging out their back pocket to spend on adopting a dog. And, you know, I've said it before, and the hardest thing I've ever had to do was to put down my little dog. You know, I didn't always feel manly walking Watson because he was a bit on freeze. But, you know, he's the only person I've ever known that was always 100% happy to see me. You know, we've all seen the adopting charges around the country, and we're certainly at the high point. And, you know, there's another one to add to that. That's the Taupo DC, and they charge $110, including microchipping, plus a year's registration. Now, sadly, we put down over 100 dogs a year, and a few are dangerous, but I'll say the majority are healthy and could be rehomed. You know, I also feel greatly for staff who would form bonds with these animals, caring for them. You know, heartbreaking to almost weekly be destroying things. You know, common sense tells me we need to try something else. You know, take a different tack, because, you know, I don't know about you, but putting down this amount of perfectly healthy animals I find heartbreaking and disturbing, to say the least. We need to reduce the cost this council charges to adopt dogs, thus tearing down a major hurdle, I believe. You know, most of these poor souls have a shocking start to life as it is, and I'm sure while they're in PNCC care, they've probably never been so looked after before with kindness in the short lives they have. You know, please vote to reduce the adoption fee, and by doing so, you'll help save the lives of dozens of dogs that could be people's very best friends. You know, they do deserve better. Councillors, please give them a second chance at life. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I find myself in agreement with Councillor Johnson, which I think is a really good way to start the day.
Yeah.
I'm agreeing with her in terms of the fact that there's no evidence that adoption fee is a barrier for adopting dogs, and I agree with her in that we should not be charging less than it costs to provide the service. In the officer's report, it outlined that the $559 was expected to cover most costs. So, it was a really compelling submission, and I think, it drew us all in to really consider that issue. And comparing amounts to other councils, it's really hard to know whether what they've included is the registration fee as well. So I don't even know if we were comparing apples with apples. So I'm in a position, I also find it very odd that this has come as a notice of motion. It's come up as a submission. The advice that was given to us by officers when we addressed the fees and services, that through the long-term plan we're consulting on everything in the plan and that we can actually change anything in the plan. So I do find it very odd that it's had to come to us in this way, but such is life. We're faced with talking about quite a minor issue right at the beginning of the day. My preference actually is to retain the $559, and my reason being, aside from those things that I agreed with Councillor Johnson on, is that the whole animal control services are requiring a more significant subsidisation by the general ratepayer now than used to, and we've had to change our policy accordingly to fit the 60 to 80% rather than 80 to 100%. I think from memory we sit right down at around 61%. So we're only just falling within our policy currently. That's because of the investments that have been made. So actually asking us to reduce it down from 559 to 425 or 311, whichever one you look at, is asking some of those in our community who can't actually afford to own a dog to subsidise more. So I'm faced with a tricky position. I think that I will have to support the amendment, but not because I agree that we should be reducing it, but because 425 is better than 311. I actually then will probably vote against this substantive to reduce this because I favour the 559.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and colleagues. As the councillor who was quite committed during the fees and charges debate to work with Councillor Naylor to see that we were actually taking things in the right direction, I find it interesting that now that we have a very specific example in front of us and a very specific consideration, I now find myself with quite a different view than Councillor Naylor in terms of how we proceed. Proof that, as we well should in this chamber, open minds always. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the themes that are, I guess, bubbling up in the debate so far. And the first one is around evidence and the claim that in the absence of any evidence, things should be seen in a particular way. Personally, I feel that there is some evidence, certainly of concern, but in the community, obviously through the submissions. But I'd say, as well, how would we actually go about getting any evidence if we don't actually try something and see if it works? And are the stakes really that high? No. This is something that we could well afford to try. It will be less than 12 months, and we will again have this debate around fees and charges. This isn't setting up forever. This is, let's have a look for 12 months. Is there an impact? Is there not? This appeals deeply to the inner experimentalist in this scientist. And I would encourage all of you to think about a very useful experiment, an experiment that frankly could save lives. And why wouldn't we do that? Because we're talking a lot about savings, and we hear about savings, so what do we want to save? The dollars or the lives?
All right, I'll go back for right of reply. No. All right, we're going to vote on the amendment. All right, so the amendment there is around changing the fee to $425 and instead of the $599. All right, so we will vote, please. So we're voting for the amendment?
Yeah, 425 instead of 311.
Yeah. That is passed. 12 votes for and 4 against. All right, we are just getting this correct. 425. So we now take the substantive, and this is around to substitute the dog adoption fee from $5.99, including desexing, registration, flea and worming, and microchipping, to instead of a fee of $425, noting that the remainder of the fee out Appendix 6, Attachment A, will remain unchanged. All right, we will vote, please. That has passed. 15 votes for and 1 against. Moving through to deliberations on submissions. This is number 8 in our papers, councillors, page 45. And this is around on the draft waste management and minimisation plan. And just ask Peter Ridge to come up and speak to that, please. And Natasha, thank you.
Kia ora koutou. The memorandum that we have today is a summary of the submissions we received on the draft waste management and minimisation plan. From here on out, we'll call it the WIMP. It also includes the analysis on the issues raised by submitters and advice on some recommended changes to the draft WIMP. As you'll see from the submissions, the key issue that most people were concerned about was the proposed food scraps curbside collection. And there was a strong level of support for this proposal. It was noted by many submitters that costs are still always an issue, and these are as yet undetermined because we haven't gone through the full development of that service, but we noted that this is a concern for many. Most submitters also favoured the inclusion of green waste. This was a question which we specifically asked for feedback on. There were many who noted that they already compost, so the food scraps collection was less of a concern for them, but that green waste often exceeds their ability to compost on site in their own backyards. So a curbside collection for green waste would be particularly advantageous for them. But again, noting if the cost is greater than what they currently pay for a green waste collection, then that's not something they'd be interested in. So we've made a recommendation for 2 changes to actions 3.6 and 3.7 in the draft WIMP. This relates to the inclusion of green waste in alongside the food scraps curbside collection. I won't go into detail around the other issues raised by submitters. There are quite a few, and I'm acutely aware of time and the other issues you have to debate. All of those are included in attachment 1. What I would note is that while we haven't recommended other changes to the draft WIMP, we acknowledge that a number of the points made by submitters are worthwhile, and often they are reflected through work that's already underway or incorporated into the actions, but perhaps not reflected in the detail that's included in the draft WIMP. So yeah, we're happy to take questions.
Thanks, Peter. Natasha, anything from you? All right, Councillor Barrett.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Natasha. Around the open days, how many more open days are planned in the future?
We haven't made a specific planning for that, but we do intend to do more of them. We found the one that we had very successful. I'm sure you're all aware from the Facebook information that they were booked out within hours. We originally had planned for 60 on the day. We made some changes in the background, got a few extra staff to assist us, and we ended up being able to accommodate 120 on that day, and they were all fully booked. So it's very successful, but we certainly intend to do more.
Thanks. I guess I'm trying to square intent with commitment. Will we be running any, in the absence of direction from council, will we be running any open days in year one of the LTP?
In absence of direction from you, yes, we fully intend to. I'm happy to come back to you with a plan through an email to the elected members via Bryce Hoskins with the amount of dates we intend to do.
Great,
Would that
thank
be
you.
sufficient?
Thank you. My other question was around hazardous waste collection, which I understand is the intent is a 2-yearly or biennial service. Is that correct?
Yes, that is, we did that last September, and the intention was to do it again in year 2, year 4, year 6, year 8, and so on and so forth, under program 1811.
Thank you. My reading of program 1811 is that there's no investment there until year 3, and I just wanted to understand then your comment around running it in year 2 when the investment doesn't start until year 3.
That's weird, because I checked Magic yesterday just to double check, because I saw your comment, and it is certainly sitting in year 2. I would need finance to comment on that potentially, because I looked at it and I saw it in year 2.
Group Manager, Property and Resource Recovery, Bryce Hosking. I'm not from finance, but I can confirm it is in year 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10.
Thank you. So does that equate to an error in the supporting information that was provided to the community during the consultation?
We'll check that and can confirm that later, but definitely in terms of our financial figures it is.
Thank you for your reference, page 90 of the supporting information, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Naylor.
Oh, thank you. Just in adding those two, adding the green waste into those 2 clauses, do we have an understanding at this stage of the additional cost that might be to council?
Are you referring to the cost to do the detailed analysis scheduled for year 1 of the LTP, or are you referring to the capital cost, just to be clear?
Both, all costs.
No worries, I can answer that. So in terms of the detailed investigation, no, we do not feel it will add any cost. We do feel that it potentially will add cost to the capital program investment that we have signalled in the LTP, but we will have a clearer indication of that once we've done the detailed investigation, and we will come back to council with those costing and recommendations.
Okay, so putting those clauses in to the actions, does that commit us to having to follow through on that in terms of capital, or will it depend on the investigations?
In my view, I don't think it does commit the council to anything until council actually votes a budget according to a particular action. There's still the opportunity to amend a previous decision. Okay. What this does through the WIMP is signal what council's intent is.
Okay, thank you. It's helpful.
All right. Thanks, Natasha. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate the work done in the background and the paper in front of us. So, councillors, we have 4 recommendations there on the screen that receive the submissions in the draft waste Management and Minimisation Plan 2024, the Council amend Action 3.6 of the draft plan to read Action 3.6, develop a citywide curbside food scraps and green waste collection service. Number 3, that Council amend Action 3.7 of the draft plan to read Action 3.7, introduce residential food scraps and green waste collection and processing. Number 4, Council instruct the Chief Executive to prepare a draft waste management and minimisation plan incorporating the changes above for presentation to the Council meeting of the 26th of June 24 for adoption. I'm happy to move that. Have a seconder, please. Deputy Mayor, thank you. Look, I just want to thank the submitters. In line with everything else that has been going on in terms of our plans, consultation and submissions, it was actually quite heartening to see a reasonable amount of submissions directly on this plan. It is quite, well, it's very important, but it sometimes gets missed in the bigger scheme of council business. Thanks to the officers for pulling everything together and look forward to the plan hopefully being adopted. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Like you, I'm appreciative of the 300 plus submitters and a couple hundred that got in touch via social media on this. And I think it was a bit of an experiment for us in terms of whether we'd do this in the mix with the long-term plan or do it the way we'd always done it before, which is keep it separate, but then of course have that disconnect between the dollars and perhaps what we'd say is the cents. So I just wanted to touch on the key themes that are here, because I do think it's really important that we actually hear what's going on in the community, specifically around resource recovery, which is an essential part of our service. And really pleased to see the endorsement around key themes, especially around getting on board with the MFE targets. Because the reality is that this community is going to hit those targets. It needs to be something that has strong community buy-in. We can do a bit through council, but honestly, it will take community buy-in. So it's really heartening to see a very strong level of support there around that. The second theme that I was really pleased to see come through strongly was around green waste, or actually green resource, and that being really the big winner here through the submission process. And would remind colleagues that it was only because we actually explicitly put that question into the consultation process that we actually got an answer back, and feedback suggests that we got that one quite right. 85% of respondents a resounding mandate to get on with the green waste. And it's remarkable to me the number of submissions that actually commented on how well those green waste and food scrap services were working in other communities in the country. And it does, for me, again, raise the question of why it takes until 2028, 2029 for us to actually bring this opportunity to our communities. Other communities have transitioned faster, and I would urge us as council and staff to keep every effort on this in terms of getting there sooner rather than later. It is a huge proportion of the resource that is currently lost and chucked in a hole in the ground in the Rangitikei, and we can do better with it, and the sooner we do it, the better. We've heard that clearly from the community. The third thing that came through was really around the support for a service review, and I think that was, again, really, really positive. It acknowledges that I think there's a broad view in the community that the current system is not perhaps optimal, and was good to see some early support there around rationalizing to a single service provider, but would note that we had submissions already specifically calling for that single service provision to be privatized, and we had other submissions specifically calling for that single service model to be in public hands. And I think that the key question that needs to continue to be focused on through the review is, if we go single provider, whether that is something that is a public service delivered by council, or whether we think an outsourcing path is the one to take. So some really excellent feedback again through those submissions. It was quite a positive vibe that came through overall, which was really heartening to see the amount of community buy-in and support around doing things even better than we currently are. I do think there's room for us to continue to improve our game here, and I would encourage us to view the Waste Management Minimization Plan 2024 as the floor that we build up from, rather than the ceiling that we remain under, because there are always opportunities to do more, to do better, and I look forward to seeing what we can deliver for the community in the next few years around circularizing the economy and getting as much of the resources coming back to our community rather than losing them to a hole in the ground. Thank you.
Councillor Isabella.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was likewise quite glad to see such widespread support for the food scraps, but it's kind of moot because we're required by the government to do it anyway. But I am really pleased to see the support for incorporating green waste collection into this. I'm fully in favour of that. I think it's great potential for landfill diversion and creating that usable resource, but it's more efficiencies out of a service that we'll have to roll out anyway. And if we have to spend that money, let's get as much bang for our buck as we can. I also just want to support comments that were made earlier about the public education element, because that came through quite strongly in the submissions. And as Councillor Barrett said, the buy-in is so important. This is like a two-way transaction. We can only collect what's put out. So I think it's been raised numerous times, but it's clear from the uptake with our public education opportunities, our open days, that there is abundant interest in the community to participate in those. So I'd love to see that momentum keep going. Very heartened to see that that is scheduled for every second. That was hazardous waste, wasn't it? I'm very pleased to see that we have other opportunities in the pipeline for people to go onto site and be educated and upskilled in terms of what they can do with their waste, because that is a question that comes up a lot. What do I do with it? What do I do with it? So in that view, I'm also very pleased to see some support for the service delivery review, particularly opportunities for soft plastic if they arise, and for widening our scope from just residential, what people are putting out there, but also looking at the entire waste picture for the whole city and where that's going and where it's ending up. So very happy to support these recommendations, and thank you very much to the staff and all the submitters. Thank you.
Councillor Harpiter.
Thank you. Just brief comments. One is, my comment is really around over consulting, and I just want to bring this comment up. Consulting on waste minimisation and waste, along with consulting on a rates review and a future development strategy all at the same time, is a lot for our community, and I really want to bring it up now because I don't know when to bring it up otherwise. So I just think that we had a lot to talk to our community about, and whether we do it all at the same time is probably, for me, I think it was too much. So I just wanted to bring it up. It's great that we have all of these discussions with our community, but do we have to have them all at the same time? So great that we got all the submissions in, but as a council, did we have to have them all at the same time? But thank you to the community for submitting, and thank you for our communication team for all the hard work they did, but did we have to have all of those conversations all at the same time? Thank you.
All right. That's our comments, and look, we've got a long day, so I'll leave it at that. We'll vote, please. That is passed. 16 votes for and none against. We move through to the late item, which is around the submission to the Parliamentary Select Committee around Māori wards. We've got a late paper there, which was sent to you separately. I'll just ask Hannah White, our Governance Manager, to speak to that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I haven't really got any additional comments to make, only to note that Horizons endorsed their submission yesterday. I haven't actually had eyes on that. I don't know if any of the elected members have. I have shared with you Rangitane o Manawatu's submission, and they have seen this one and are happy with it. So happy to take any questions.
All right. There are none, so thank you, Hannah. Okay, councillors, we have our submission there, which you've all been sent. We've also got a couple of copies of the Local Government New Zealand one from the 50-odd mayors and chairs, and Rolkawa's submission as well. So I'm happy to move this around recommending that Council agree the submission as drafted attachment 1, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Look, I think it's been well versed, and I think it's absolutely upon it, to be honest, that we should be absolutely speaking against this piece of legislation. I've lit up the board, so we'll go to Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And just briefly, I found this a particularly good example of a submission from Council, and I think it's the sort that Palmerstonians can well be proud of. In fact, I was going to go so far as suggesting that LGNZ might actually start an award for the best submissions to select committee processes, and I think this one would well deserve a nomination and, in fact, a win. It's a great statement, and it's the sort the government would do well to heed. It is completely full of arguments that will resonate highly with government because it is, in fact, their own rhetoric turned to good use in defense of local communities and consultative processes and representation arrangements that are working very well indeed. So I wanted to commend the Mayor, commend colleagues, and commend officers for rising in defense of our whole community's right to a consistent approach towards and to a fair measure of control over our own destiny. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'm more than happy to endorse this submission, and I'm very happy that we were able to get it turned around in what I would like to say is an insultingly small amount of time that was given for public submissions on this matter. And actually, it's unfortunately indicative of the disrespect that some in government have towards public consultation and submission process, while on the one hand proclaiming that democracy is very important and that's why we need polls on Māori wards, on the other hand thumbing their nose at democracy by foreshortening public submission process and the proper scrutiny of legislation that's put in front of Parliament. So I think that a down level of hypocrisy in the way that this has been handled so far by government, and I think it's very important that communities across the country stand up and say, actually, we're not going to stand for this. We're not going to stand for this anymore. We have a local government system here that the government says is important and that they respect. We are elected every 3 years to represent the community. If the community is dissatisfied with our decisions, they have the opportunity to vote us out. Absolutely, they do. That's democracy. Not having a referendum on decisions that the government decides there should be a referendum on, at the expense to local ratepayers, and at the risk of causing division and hate in our own community. I think it's reprehensible. So I'm really pleased that we've got this submission in. And while I'm on my feet, I'd just like to commend Rangitani and Manawatu for their submission, which I thought was excellent and firm, and I approve. Thank you.
Isabella.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. All I want to say on this is that 5 days for submissions is an absolute disgrace.
Councillor Bowen.
Absolutely ditto. I actually could not believe it when I read when submissions would have to be into this process. I think it's, well, to quote the word that was used in the chamber at the first reading, appalling. Absolutely appalling. You know, the process of select committee is supposed to ensure good lawmaking. It's supposed to make sure there are no unintended consequences. It's supposed to draw public comment and input into the process. What we find ourselves in is something that is tightly drafted to reflect party lines and isn't, in my view, a genuine opportunity for the community widely to engage with this process. I want to commend our staff for turning this around so quickly and putting together what I think is a thorough and very good submission, which reflects our views as previously expressed around this chamber. But this process itself is fundamentally flawed, and I'm absolutely appalled by it.
Thank you, colleagues. Look, I agree with all your comments. I think if we just look above us on the city crest, I think that's what we're fighting for. So I ask you to vote, please. And that is passed 14 votes for and 1 abstention. All right. We now move through to our main order of business, which is number 9, which is around deliberations on the 2024-34 long-term plan and associated documents. And I'll ask our officers, David Murphy, our Chief Planning Officer, our Chief Financial Officer, Cameron Mackay, and Chief Infrastructure Officer, Chris Dyberg, to the table. That's page 71 of our documents, please.
Mōre ne koutou, Mr Mayor, elected members, council staff, members of the public in the chamber. We're going to take the paper as read, just a couple of very brief introductory comments. Just want to acknowledge the work by elected members, officers and the community to get to this point. It's been 20 months of work to get to the deliberations today, and appreciate you've got some tough decisions and deliberations to make today. We've had a really good response from the community, which has contributed to the process. There's a series of recommendations within the report that was suggested in terms of the order. I understand the run sheet is going to dictate in terms of the order that we're going to follow in terms of working through those. So I encourage you to work from that. We appreciate that there'll be a significant number of questions over the next 2 days. We also appreciate that you'll have some really difficult trade-offs and decisions to make. Officers will be doing their best to describe when we're asked to answer questions, the implications of your recommendations, not whether you should be doing them or not doing them. We'll be emphasising the implications of the recommendations you're looking to make. We're happy to answer any general questions on the paper to begin with. Other than that, obviously, the three of us and the broader team are available to assist with questions on the individual components of the recommendations that we'll work through over the next couple of days. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Cameron, Chris, any commentary?
Through you, Mr Mayor, just one piece to add to that. Just to remind elected members, I guess one of the key strategies that we did have to put in terms of the draft plan was accelerated debt repayment. So we do have from years 4 onwards to basically create the headroom required against our debts. Obviously, you're going to be making a series of decisions over the next couple of days. We will be doing our best alongside you to just highlight, I guess, what implications that might have against that particular scenario around accelerated debt repayment at this point in time. That may need to change depending on how decisions play out, and we'll inform you of what the implications of that are. It's just to keep that in the back of your minds that's also part of what was in the draft 10-year plan.
All right. Okay, we'll get into some questions. Thank you. Look, on table 1, I just note that breakdown of indicative rates around year 1, that we've actually got a slight, I mean, every little bit helps, and we've got a slightly different final draft starting figure. And we've obviously had some changes there.
Sorry, yes, we have got a different starting position. I'm taking the opportunity just to revisit some of our assumptions now that we're getting closer, I guess, to adoption time. There's been, I guess, three main components of that. One being, you'll be aware at the moment that the insurance market is particularly difficult. And whilst we had made some assumptions around that in the original draft, it's been made clear to us that that would not be sufficient in terms of covering our insurance policies. We also, if you recall, the recent third quarter report around some of our revenue assumptions, where we perhaps are finding that we're collecting a little bit more than what we initially provided for in the budget, so we've reflected that in the 10-year plan as well. And also at the moment, we've seen an opportunity where we've been able to reduce the interest rate assumption for the first 3 years by 0.2% based on updated market conditions. We think we're probably at that sort of peak point now, we think, based on current advice. Plus you have the advantage of the interest rates hedging that's been in place that's already in place, and we've factored in when that's going to be rolling off and the likely rates that will be repriced at. So we've done some work around that and felt that we could make that change.
Okay, so obviously some higher insurance and services costs, but that's positively tempered by what you said, lower interest costs and higher revenue.
Yes.
Gives us a starting point of 11.1.
Yes.
Okay. All right, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of general questions from me to you, Cameron. The first one is that in years 4, 5 and 6, looking out, the headroom is quite close to the limit. I note that there are some recommendations from elected members to be debated that include deferring capital projects out to years 4, 5 and 6. Would that have a negative effect? Well, would we still have the capacity to do that given we're so close to headroom in those years?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I guess at this point it's too difficult to give you a definitive answer because there are a whole range of potential decisions that you could make across the 10-year program. Deferring to certain years may have an impact in that particular year or subsequent years following, but also it has to be balanced with the level of total revenue that the council raises during that time. So there's two real competing items that we've got to consider for you as you make those decisions, and the best we'll be doing for you is informing you of where those limits are sitting relative to decisions that you make, and perhaps what acceleration of debt repayment you may need to put in place to reflect those decisions. We may have to alter what we currently have in place for that.
Okay, so you'll be keeping a watching brief on that and informing us as we go through?
Yes.
The other question, which is related to that, and I think which you partially answered, is, those headroom calculations also rely on a certain level of income. So if rates increases are reduced over the course of the 10-year plan, clearly income is going to be reduced. And then how does that impact on the headroom? I take it the answer is going to be the same. You're just going to keep an eye on that as it goes?
We will be keeping an eye on it. I guess just to remind elected members, the calculation basically is a debt to revenue limit of 250%. So for every dollar of revenue you can borrow, I guess 2.5 times that. So if you reduce revenue, then the amount that you can borrow reduces. That is the concept, but it depends as well on what decisions you make about the level of capital investment that you make through the 10-year period.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Barrett.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just a few questions here. Firstly, wanted to pick up on the point that we've been on this journey for 20 months. And was in some conversations recently with colleagues around how we got to the point of having a proposal for the community rather than having, say, a high, medium, and low option that we could actually have gone out with, 3 distinct options. if in future we wanted to go with a kind of multi-option approach to the community, when in the process and how would we signal that?
Just to clarify, is that specifically in relation to the rates options or a general sort of question about it?
No, a general question. So let's say hypothetical fees rise might be 4, 8, and 12. If we want to go out with that rather than say just an 8.
It's an interesting question. I mean, presume earlier the better, I guess, to enable those to be incorporated into budgets. I think it's, you know, until we work through the vision and the goals and the plans and what you want to achieve, it can be, I guess, somewhat of a challenge about to determine what those key issues are and what the options are. But probably, you know, as the strategy and plan process is being built up and we're identifying those key issues, I think at that stage, you know, we start with an environmental scan, we work in a vision, we develop those plans. As we're getting a sense of the key issues, I think if there are ones you are wanting to signal firmly at that point that we want to develop explicit options, and that would be the time.
Great, thank you. Just wanted to ask around the demographic information that was requested of submitters this time around, and understand kind of what proportion of submitters took up the opportunity to provide us with some demographic insight.
I don't have the answer to that on hand. I'm not sure whether that's, I'm not sure Hannah or Liv are able to get us that course.
Good morning. Really, under a lot of the, I guess, kind of legislation that guides us, we have to have a clear reason as to why we ask those demographic data. And we did consider it for quite a few of the scenarios, but the only one we ended up actually doing it on was the rates review, because obviously those things make a difference as to how people vote. So we don't have that. I guess from your reading of the submissions, you'd see that we have quite a wide variety, more than I think that we've seen, especially in age, than we've seen in other submissions. But yeah, we don't collect it unless we have a very clear reason as to why we need that data.
Thanks. And in terms of what came through in those demographics this time around, do we have a sense of how well the demographics of those that chose to make submissions kind of reflects the demographics in the community as a whole?
I think we've got a pretty good spread this time round. Like I think we've got a better spread of our community than what we've had in previous consultations. And I guess part of that has been, as an example, working like with the Pacifica community a lot more about different ways that they can make submissions when the formal process is a bit different, and you saw that come through in the hearings. So we've tried to, I guess, show how you can give submissions in different ways. I guess the area that I would always like to probably see more is, I guess, in like Māori, and seeing some more come through in that, from that, I don't want to say demographic, you know what I mean, but yeah, I'd like to see some more there, and I guess that's a constant work in progress, yeah.
Thanks. Just while we're questioning submissions, were there many submissions around the College Street Cycleway? Could we get you on a microphone, please?
Andrew Boyle, Head of Community Planning. You probably were, but I can't remember any specifically.
Thank you. Just wanted to pick up as well around 6.3, which is around the rates review. And just wanted to understand what range of options are available to us. I know there's been some questions to officers, and that would be helpful to understand here in the chamber what the range of options are to us as elected members, having consulted on 3 options kind of at 2 ends of the spectrum and one somewhere in between.
Through Mr. Mayor, I guess, again, it's an interesting question to try and answer, but I think as long as you are responding to submissions, the ultimate decision is yours. There is obviously, whatever you do decide on in terms of rating system, you do need to consider any transitionary arrangements and factor that in as such, and that's why we've recommended to you in the past that even if you were to go to, say, a full capital value system, we would recommend that the hybrid split would be a good starting point that you consulted on. I guess the question is, whatever you ultimately decide, if it is different to what we went out in the proposal with, would it be so far different that people may have come to different conclusions and submitted differently had we have put it out in a different way?
Thank you. So to pick on a specific scenario that wasn't explicit in the consultation, but, you know, has at least been discussed and heard from some parts of the community, if we wanted to go to a 50-50, would be possible.
Through Mr. Mayor, I think what my advice to that would be that you would, if you're signalling to go that direction, perhaps you would be best to adopt, say, the hybrid model as outlined, and signal and consult on through the next, either through the next annual plan as an amendment to the rating policy, or the next long-term plan. That's where you want to head towards, because it's within the range of full capital value and hybrid. It's somewhere in the middle. I think you can move there, but you wouldn't be able to move there, I don't believe, in the first year, and adopt that in the first year.
Thank you for that. And in effect, we have a conversation with the community every year about the entire system anyhow. Is that correct?
We don't necessarily have a conversation about the rating system as such. The rating system is adopted and it forms part of the rating policy, but I guess you can have an updated conversation on that if you so chose.
Great, thank you. And just a minor one to finish off, Mr. Mayor, but 5.4 made reference, the headline on 5.4 was around parking infringement revenue, and it talked about $3 million of revenue, and I just wanted to understand, is that parking infringement revenue, or is that overall parking revenue?
Infringement revenue, I believe.
Is we get $3 million just in infringements, or that's the expectation?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It was a question about the supplementary marketing and communication report, which I think shows an impressive amount of activity, but there's no next steps in that. So I just wondered what the plan was for reviewing how effective our engagement has been around this long-term plan, and how that reflection will come back to elected members. Thanks, Liv.
So there will be a broader LTP review, but after big exercises, our team also looks at what we could do better and where we did well, and we can maybe bring that back as part of that same report to you.
That'll be great. Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you very much for the report. I just want to carry on from where Councillor Johnson was querying before, just in terms of headroom. And you've seen all of the suggested changes to the long-term plan around, I guess, deferments of CapEx. If we adopted all of those in one hit, do we actually understand the pressures in terms of deliverability in the out years?
We haven't specifically considered that. Obviously, any addition to the program in the outer years has an impact, and I guess where our focus has been is really looking at the next few years based on the current draft, recognising that there will be some changes to that. I guess if you look at a lot of the things that move around, they tend to be sort of probably big dollar item amounts. So in a perverse sort of way, they don't always have as much of an impact because they're, if you deferred 20 small projects, it has more of an impact than deferring one big one because you just have the overhead of project delivery. So look, I can't give you a specific answer, but I can just generally speaking, yes, there will be impacts, but it's hard to know until you sort of settle it and then look at what it's landed on top of already.
So how do we as councillors actually get a sense of, say for example, in year 4 we might have maybe $130 million worth of CapEx actually put in the plan for that year, but if we adopted some of the recommendations which have actually already been circulated around members, if that moved to, say for example, 210 million or 220 million, how do we actually get a sense of the impact of that in terms of deliverability before we even start that process?
Yeah, it's hard to be specific. I guess, and just going back to some of the answers I've probably given in the chamber over the last few months, is that when we look at even just look at the next 3 years, so next year is about very similar to this year what's in the draft. But as you get on the outer years, it changes quite a lot. So we've been looking quite deeply about the delivery methodology and working out, okay, so if this is what we have to deliver, what would we have to put in place to have confidence around the delivery? So the first one is just being, confident around 100% of what we're doing now. So we can't do things as we're doing now. So we've talked about previously doing things like beginning planning and design a lot earlier, getting procurement lined up earlier and what have you. So we would have to look at those outer years and then come up with a methodology to deliver what's in there. I think the thing would be if we did push it out to year 4, we would start looking now in terms of saying, so what would we have to put in place to deliver that? Generally, they're capital projects, so they're, some of the options are things like potentially outsourcing some of the project management and things like that. So we do have levers to pull, yes, certainly with time.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm trying to get to here is at the moment we could actually graph the CapEx expenditure from year 1 to year 10, right?
Yep.
Could we do the same for, say, for example, all of the recommendations which have been provided around sort of deferment of capital programs? Could we actually graph that against, using your current planning as a baseline before we even get underway today? Because otherwise, what will happen is that we'll actually go through this one item at a time, and we have no understanding at all of the impact of those decisions. So can we get a comment on that, please?
I'm not sure I've entirely understood what you're wanting us to graph. So would it be just like the number of projects or the size of the projects that we would track? So we've got the dollars, but, which we tend to focus on the dollars. So what exactly would we be tracking?
I guess we have a certain capacity to be able to deliver CapEx, and that's predicated on the availability of contractors, our own in-house design and project management office and things like that.
Right.
And I guess what concerns me is that we could make a whole bunch of decisions about deferment today, and we actually put ourselves into a situation where we cannot possibly deliver those programs.
Yeah, I suppose I come back to the points I made before, is that I believe that with the right time frame around planning and organising what have you, we would come up with a methodology. But what we wouldn't be able to do, certainly, and I think what you're getting at, is we assume we have our same delivery capability today. You add more onto it. You can't just do the same a whole lot more with the same. It would be a combination of probably beefing up our internal capability, contracting in staff to do that, but a lot of it would also be, outsourcing projects. So if you think of some of the bigger projects, particularly that I know that bulk up those numbers, things like earthquake-prone buildings, nature calls, they are big dollar projects. We wouldn't deliver them internally. We'd have some internal oversight and project management, but the bulk of the resources to deliver them would be outsourced. So so like I'm saying, it doesn't have as much of an impact, funnily enough, as adding lots and lots of little projects that we might deliver internally. So it comes back to being really clear about what's in your program and what is the best methodology to deliver it. So I'm not as concerned as what you might think.
One possible suggestion, if I could help us have a quick chat with Cam as you were speaking there, Chris, is we do have to report back, I think it's in early June before this final adoption towards the end of June. So certainly if there were significant issues around deliverability as a result of the decisions that were made today, that could be flagged in that report back, and I think it's scheduled for the 10th to 12th of June before there is then final adoption towards the end of June. So.
Final question, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, David, for that response, but might that be too late?
Well, again, certainly I think we'd look to flag if there are any significant deliverability issues emerging during the course of the 2 days, but when we step back and look at that across the cumulative effect of the decisions over the 2 days, if we identified anything, we would, we could bring that back to you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Just on that line of questioning, and probably to you, Chris, we've had approaches around, and of course other councils do a lot of this, it's around the procurement, is the design and build model, where essentially officers are not that involved as they are in the normal process that we are traditionally now. And I'm thinking of things like community centres, arena, all those sorts of things where it is a project. Have we thought about that, explored that?
Absolutely. So I guess that's what I'm getting at in terms of some of the delivery options. So so particularly with sort of those big complicated projects, you would do an option where you may effectively you go through a procurement and you do there's a whole range of them, but certainly design and build, and as we've talked about in some of them, there's even ones that might involve ownership and transfer, boot, PPP, whatever. Yep. But yeah, certainly that would be how we would deliver those big ones. Certainly well beyond the capability of our internal staff.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Councillor Harpiter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one quick question on the regional freight ring road. It talks about in the paper on page 80 about discussions with NZTA. And I just wondered if they had been favourable discussions in order to bring that forward to year one, that we were thinking that we were actually going to be getting the money, so that's why we were bringing it forward to year one.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. I mean, if I was to be honest, there's been some slightly mixed messages from officers at NZTA about that. So prior to finalising this report, the conversation was that provided they had, so they've included their co-funding for the regional freight ring road in years 1 to 3 of the SHIP based on our original timing, which was year 2. The original conversation with NZTA was that if their funding is in years 1 to 3, they have the flexibility to move it. We had a meeting this morning where we got a slightly different answer, but I'm confident, based on some other conversations we're having, that there is increasing support to get that business case done. So in the event that NZTA didn't support co-funding in year 1, we could still have a conversation with the council about starting that work without co-funding if we're wanting to start to particularly look at some of the funding, new funding mechanisms that are being looked at for delivering those types of pieces of infrastructure.
And how long does it take to do a business case?
The indicative business case for the regional freight ring road is down for 2 years. It'll be a significant piece of work. There'll be a lot of detail to work through at the likes of Bunnythorpe, Ashurst, power lines on KB Road, alignments at Longburn. It is a significant and complex piece of work.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just 3 questions from me. Thanks to all officers who have already answered a lot of questions in the last few days. It's been much appreciated. The recommendation 5 for the additional meeting on the 10th of June, had that not been, I'm just trying to understand why there's an extra meeting in there that hadn't previously been planned for. Were we originally just going to put the draft together and confirm it at the end of June? Or what's kind of prompted the extra step?
Through you, Mr Chair. The reason why the suggestion for that meeting is, I guess it depends on the level and the amount of change that has come through these deliberations, and there are certain things that we'll be able to update along the way over the course of these 2 days, but there may be some things such as decisions around the rating system and that sort of thing where you may want to just confirm, I guess, the impacts of that. We won't necessarily be able to do some of that on the fly. So I guess it's a meeting there in case we need it to bring back the final drafting of the decisions out of today, bearing in mind that very much on the 26th of June, when you're due to adopt the long-term plan, that at that point it would be very difficult to be making changes at that point in time.
Okay, thank you. Just looking at the cost of growth on page 12 of the financial strategy, there's the revenue from development contributions of 46.9 million and developer agreements of 125 million, which adds up to 172 million. The overall cost of growth being 296 million. What is there some other revenue that addresses that $123 million shortfall, or is there something I've missed?
Through you, Mr Mayor, so it's probably a few things within that, but probably one that's worth noting is the timing of when we perhaps collect development contributions versus when the actual growth infrastructure has to be built isn't always at the exact same time, and also reflecting that there'll be some elements to growth where you may not get exactly 100% of it funded through DCs. There could be the odd sort of thing there, but I think primarily my view is the timing of when the growth expenditure occurs versus when we actually collect the DC revenue, because the DC policies for a 20-year lifespan is probably accounts for a big chunk of why you'd have some differences in any given year.
Okay, that's to do with the lag, 123 million worth of lag. Is that correct? So, sorry, so that 123 million is all to do with timing or the lag of that?
There'll be an element to timing. There'll be an element to do with there is some growth that is of a general nature that can't be tagged for specific development as well. So as I said to you, there'll be some bits that development contributions won't fully be recovering. So for argument's sake, you have some funding in there for developer agreements. They'll be for specific new areas of growth, but you may actually have some upgrade of infrastructure in existing areas due to growth as well.
So are growth costs being covered by developer agreements and development contributions, or are you saying there's some ratepayer contribution to growth as well?
Yeah, I would think there would be some ratepayer contributions in terms of growth as well. Yes.
Okay. And do we have an understanding of how much of that shortfall is to do with the lag and how much is to do with ratepayer contribution?
I would suggest that would be pretty difficult to quantify, but no, I don't have that to hand.
Okay. And sorry, Mr. Mayor, just trying to understand this. So the assumptions in the revenue do actually include the interest costs of that, as per the new policy. So that all of that's been included in our revenue assumptions for this, has it?
Yes. So remembering that that the interest in the development contribution policy is for back work, so things that we have already constructed. So yes, that is accounted for.
Okay. Okay. And just the final question relates to the strategic priority grants, and the amount for the year one has been provided through the questions. And through the questions of the breakdown of the increases for community support included a $360,000 being an increase in strategic priority grants, which I think is around 29%. And so I'm just wanting to understand how much of that CPI or how much of that is anything over CPI.
I don't have that answer just in front of me, but Scott, the finance manager, might have that to hand.
Good morning, Mayor and elected members. Thanks for that, Cam. Scott Answer, Finance Manager. The strategic priority grants are set on a 3-year basis that doesn't quite line up to the start of the LTP. So some of the funding in year one is tagged to the final year of grants per that policy. I'd have to go away and check with the wider team how much of that is over and above inflation, but there are some funds tagged based on that policy.
Okay, that would be great if that could come back. Thanks. That's all from me, Mr. Mayor.
Just on that line of questioning, with growth, there's transport, and there would be some NZTA funding with that as well?
Yes, I would imagine there would be.
And that would be quite significant? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, that is the questions at this stage. I just want to get through this first recommendation to accept the submissions and acknowledge the submitters, and we have a number in the crowd here today. And this is around, and then we'll break councillors for a cup of tea. So recommendations to council that council receive submissions on the 2024-34 long-term plan, noting submissions include comments on the city's strategy and plans, financial and infrastructure strategies, development contributions policy, revenue and financing policy, the rates remission and postponement policies, rating system options, and significance and engagement policy. I'm happy to move those and seconded by the Deputy Mayor. If I could just make a couple of comments. We've got lots to do today, so short. I just want to acknowledge, we received over 1,400 submissions and over 150 submitters came to hearings. So, we had a week of hearings, and just want to acknowledge everybody that's been part of that process. We actually had a number of first-time people, which was really good. We have our usual actors that come and present to us from all our different sectors. It was nice to see them again, but it was especially nice to see general members of the public that came in and wanted to engage with us. So I just want to acknowledge that. We've got a number of difficult decisions to make in the next couple of days, from rates to wastewater plants to our long-term plan and what's possibly changed, etc., etc. So just want to acknowledge the colleagues around the table as well. There's been a lot of work to date, a lot of work, and even to get to the starting gate, we've done a huge amount of work. So I hope 2 days will go well, but this is very much just the start of it. Councillor Naylor.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I also just really wanted to acknowledge the work of staff in terms of what went into the engagement with the community. Also, I was looking at the of that engagement. Obviously, an overwhelming amount of feedback through many sources. The general public sessions outlined in the report covers the council-run meetings, and I just want to take an opportunity to acknowledge those in the community who actually mobilised themselves also to run some community-led meetings. That hasn't been included, so I just wanted to make mention of it because in my long time of being involved with local government over the last 20 plus years, I've never seen such significant turnouts to public meetings. There was 300 to the first one and 250 to the second one. Many who attended those meetings did subsequently make submissions, and those are the councillors around the table who attended. We obviously encouraged them to do so. So we've heard those views through the submissions. Many expressed strong concern at those meetings. Many actually expressed outrage at what they felt that council was doing in planning. That feedback helps inform my thinking in this process, and because it's not included in the report, I just want to take acknowledgement of that.
Councillor Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, from my questions together, I was interested in how this engagement process has gone for council, and I do also want to thank staff for all of their work on this. I think it's been huge. But probably my reflection is that we exist in our own little echo chamber here in council, in local government in general. My feeling in all of this was you'd have to be living under a rock not to know that we were consulting on our long-term plan and all the other things that Councillor Harper referenced before. But actually the reality is that a vast majority of our community go about their business unbothered by the machinations of their local council. So yes, we saw a large amount of submissions, 1,400. That's a really small percentage of our community. Let's put that in some context. Yes, we saw great turnout to meetings. I would note particularly the 800 people who turned out to Council's own expo. But again, a very small percentage of our community. So I'm not disregarding the various opinions that have come through from that, but I do think it's important that we keep it in context as we go through today. The engagement was as good as we could make it. I'm confident in it. I look forward to seeing the things that we think we could do better next time, and maybe that is something about how we engage more widely with our community. But yes, really happy to receive the submissions that we did and to reflect on the range of opinions that they reflected from across our community.
All right. Thank you, councillors. We will vote on receiving the submission. And that has passed 16 votes for, none against. All right, we will break for tea and we'll be back into the chamber at 11:05. To the public that are here, and welcome. Kia ora tātou, welcome back. Councillors, what we'll be doing is the next part of the meeting around the deliberations is we'll look at rates first, and then we'll look at 2A and 2B, which is around assumptions to budgets, carry forwards. Then we'll look at recommendation 2C, which is previous council decisions in two parts. And then recommendation 2D, which is around additional officer changes around a number of different items around the government's local water done well, funding changes there, the regional freight ring road business case, Kiki Whenua, seismic, Tutanganui. There's a whole lot of things there that we need to discuss. Our recommendation 2E will be around the organisation's annual emissions targets, and then 2F will be recommendations from committees, and then 2G we will look at, that is where the bulk of our different recommendations have come forward, and that will be around either removing or decreasing or deferring capital expenditure. We'll look at the wastewater plant. We'll look at removing, in an operational sense, removing, decreasing or deferring expenditure. Then in capital expenditure, additions, increases, bring forwards, and the same with operational expenditure around increases, additions, bringing forward, and then there'll just be a catch-all at the end. We're going to get through all of that today. That is the plan. That is the plan. All right. So we're going to go to rates first, and this was a significant one, and so it should be. There was many submissions on our rating review. And there was those that were comfortable where they were in a land valuation. There was those that wanted to definitely go to capital, and there were those in the middle, and the hybrid model. So, councillors, I've put something up to you that is around the hybrid rate option, and I've done this around balance and fairness to all sectors of our city, and it's around council assuming the hybrid rate option of 70% land value, 30% capital value for the next 3 years to be reviewed at the next LTP in year 4 with a view to the capital percentage. I've been deliberate in that for the fact that there are views around the table, and if we go very quickly, it could have very, very bad and unforeseen consequences for us. Now, some may say we've got to be brave and do that, but I just get you to have a look at some other cities that have done this, and it is starting to bite. And Rotorua is one of those, where the business community have really tailed off. 4 consents in a whole year. We're still very strong here, and that is, we are still very much a business town. So it will have varying effects right throughout different sectors, from residential through to commercial, business, industrial, and I'd like to hope that you would back this, because it is what we've gone out with and what we've consulted on as well. So I'll open it up for any comments to this. Mr. Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. While holding my right to speak to the substantive, I would propose an amendment here, which would see us go to a 50-50 hybrid in 3 equal steps, years 1, 2, and 3, and call for a seconder on that. Take Councillor Dennison.
All right. So moved by you, councillor, seconded by councillor Dennison. All right, we're going to just speak to the amendment.
Yep. Thank you. While the text is coming to screen, this is one of those most fundamental questions. It's around who pays what, and there's few things more important for us to consider as a community. I think the mayor is quite right in terms of summarizing up some of the feedback that came through the submissions process. Some quite compelling arguments around our council moving in the direction that every other city in New Zealand has moved, which is towards CV or to CV. There's also some quite compelling arguments that came through around phasing in any change that came and taking it at a manageable pace. And obviously we did hear from some submitters who appreciated the current system and were reluctant to change. But on balance, for me, the messages that came through most strongly were that the right way forward is to go both a bit slower and a bit further, and that's what this particular amendment is about. It taps into the clear advantages of CV while phasing in the impact on those who've historically benefited from the land value approach. And again, those stronger advantages of capital value, a better relationship with the ability to pay, which is fundamentally what we would expect in a tax system that is progressive. It's about rating the entire asset, which makes sense for the business community, and I know we'll hear a bit about the business community. I want to underscore the fact that moving towards CV, and CV in fact would have the majority of businesses in this community actually seeing a rates reduction. So we need to be very clear that there are some distinct advantages around CV. I also want to be very clear that we need to move at a sustainable pace. So thinking about timing here, and I'm referencing, where I was at certainly last year versus where I'm at this year. I think that message has come through very clearly around taking timing into consideration and doing this at a pace that works for our community, which is why the recommendation is to go 3 equal steps in the next 3 years. Gives people time to plan, to adjust, and to accommodate, and we would be in a position then in 3 years' time as a community for that future council to consider any further changes at that point. So would urge colleagues to support this as the right way forward, a bit slower, a bit further, completely workable, and bringing a measure of relief to those who need it most. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Harpiter. You're just speaking to the amendment.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I can't support this. I think that for our entire community, looking at all people in a community, including commercial, residential and rural, I think this is a tough option for our entire community to start for this next term. So I think the option that the Mayor put up is the right option. So for me, I can't go with this option going forward. I think it's too hard to go too soon. So I think the 30-70 is the right way to go. So 50-50 is not the right way to go for our entire community, particularly looking commercial, rural and residential. So that's why I won't be supporting this amendment. Thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was pleased to second this recommendation because it's around the pace of change. And the 30 come through as a proposal, a preferred option in the draft. And there were some examples that come through in the submissions that actually showed that even still had some adverse effects as far as the quantum of increase that those ratepayers would be affected by. It's true that some of those were from the commercial sector, but there's differentials that we have in place that we can again alter where need be. But nevertheless, the pace of change going slower. So instead of 30 in the first year, on this recommendation, it's proposing a third to get to 50-50 hybrid would be a lift of 16.6%. And that's way more moderate. It's a little over half the effect of change than jumping to 30 in one move and holding pattern. And when we make any changes, I believe we need to bring the community along with us rather than having these knee-jerk effects that have come through in the submission. So I feel like this is one of the fundamental changes, certainly, but there's a principle here too that this will bring and achieve. Because fundamentally, it's around, is capital value have more merit ultimately? And we can still review that as we go along this path. And 50-50 is actually a bit of the best and worst of both rating systems if we were to get to that point in 3 years' time. And certainly an opportunity to review, and a future council will get to decide that. So any change, I think we need to have this across multiple terms viewpoint. We talk about intergenerational investment with our capital. This is like making an inter-term decision on a principle is capital worth exploring? And a majority of councils have agreed that that has merit. And I think through the submission process, a majority either want capital or a change. That's clear in the numbers. And so therefore it comes around how do we move with change. And I believe 30% has come through as having some adverse effects. And I've been one to advocate a pace of change that's more acceptable. And 16.6 step changes is more acceptable. And we can go a little bit further in the steps. We can have a line of sight planned out in our long-term plan for the first 3 years to get to that 50-50 milestone. And yeah, so concurring with the other points Councillor Barrett had, mindful of the time of debate. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Can I just ask a question, and actually of the officers? Is this legal?
Mr. Mayor and Councillors, Steve Patterson, Strategy Manager Finance. From my perspective, yes, though I would just make one or two brief comments in terms of the implications. The council can only have one general rate base, as mentioned in the papers. And so in the beginning, we would need to decide, well, the most likely outcome of this resolution, if it passed, would be we'd continue, at least for the time being, with a general rate that was based on the land value. And we would implement a targeted rate based on the capital value to fund some particular activity or activities of the council. So progressively over time, that targeted rate would need to change in terms of what it was funding. The proposal that was out there in public at the moment was suggesting it would fund at the 30% level more or less the total cost, well, not quite the total cost, but nearly the total cost of what the budget said, of all of the activities that contribute mainly to Goal 1, which was transport, economic development, urban design and housing. Those 4 activities, the cost of them at the moment, as reflected in the budget as it stands as a draft, is slightly more than what that 30% would generate. So effectively, if we were moving to getting a bit, roughly half of that sum, we'd perhaps be targeting in the first year, maybe something like transport plus something else. That's what we were looking to fund from the targeted rate. And then in the following year, needing to target funding something else as well. And the following year, something else again. So one of the key things that we considered in coming up with the proposal was what proportion of the total rates were we looking to obtain from each of the differential groups, commercial, residential, etc. And so, as Councillor Dennison mentioned, there's a differential that's involved in achieving that. So in the material that was involved in the public consultation, we had assumptions about what the differentials would be, both for the general rate and the targeted rate. And if this passes, then we'll have to go away and model what needs to happen to the differentials in order to achieve the outcomes for each of the groups that that you're suggesting. So that's something that will take us just a little while, and we'll do sometime today or tomorrow to be able to work that out. So that's sort of an implication from my perspective.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'll just speak to this. I won't be supporting this. I think that just has risen my risk level around our challenges to us legally. But look, regardless of that, we didn't consult on this. As simple as that. It's very subjective also around what is fair, and we all can have different views on that. I don't think land value is very fair, and neither is capital. So the fairness is very subjective to what you personally believe. I just want to correct the mover on every city has made this change. New Plymouth is land, Napier is land, Nelson is land, Invercargill is land, and Wellington City is going back to land. So in regional, I know the vast majority of councils have moved to capital. They're mainly either big metro cities or rural or provincial councils. Regional New Zealand and cities hasn't. So I just changed that statement at the start, which is actually incorrect. But look, it's all about, do we want to move? Absolutely we do want to move. I'm trying to give you some balance and do that over the next 3 years. If we're looking to have investment in our city with Tutanganui and all that, this is a great way to kill it. This will not, businesses need surety. There's nothing, this is a bit hairy-fairy for me, at least with a locked-in land value and capital value percentage for the next 3 years. They know what that's going to be for the next 3 years, and decisions can be made on investment for that. And I realise that a lot of you are talking about residential ratepayers. I would argue that residential ratepayers get a lot more out of their rates than the commercial sector, that the business sector pay. They don't use the library, they don't go and use the, they don't go and use the walk, but they pay a significant amount of rates. They are part of our city, they're part of our sectors. So councillors, there's unforeseen consequences in this. I don't disagree at getting there, but just take some steps. This is a very quick way of doing it. It's something that we haven't signalled to people, and to me it's a little bit on the fly, and I won't be supporting it. I urge you not to support it. There's unforeseen consequences in this. Councillor Bellin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to the mover and seconder. I am willing to support this this amendment or alternative. I've really appreciated the wide variety of views that have come through on this, and many opposing views. This is a really interesting issue to work through. I think what is clear is that there is no clear majority preference, and there's no clear winner. All of the options are tough for someone, and where CV is quite widely viewed as the best available proxy for ability to pay, not perfect, but best available to us. It reflects the whole value of the property, not just part of it, as an accurate reflection of how the property is being used, and incorporates the element of choice. LV is quite widely viewed as properly incentivising the development and land use that we'd like to see. So with a hybrid model, what we're really doing is allocating values to those two principles. And what we're doing with this option is valuing development incentive at 70% and weighting ability to pay as a sort of fairness lens proxy at 30%. So to my mind, if we're going to have a differential that is principle based, I'd want to see those principles consistently applied, and both of those elements are treated the same, 50-50. So from officers' answers, both now and just previous to the break, I think this is within scope for us. A number of submissions did question why we didn't propose a 50-50 split in the first place. A number did indicate support or a preference for that option. And with such mixed views as to what's the correct approach, I am in support of having a consistent principle which treats them both equally and seeks to phase that in a managed way, because 50-50 seems fair to me from that basis. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am going to support this amendment. I do think that provides us an opportunity for a more appropriate pace towards change. I started out this process very much in the belief that land value was fairest, and I still do believe that if we were starting from scratch, land value would be where we want to go. I think the impact of the submissions has really made me aware of perhaps some of the impact of change in terms of adversely to some ratepayers, that if we are going to change, that we do need to look at how we can mitigate the impact to those who are adversely affected. Moving at a more appropriate pace, I think, is the best way for us to do that. The submissions in our papers, in terms of the summary of submissions, had around 430 submissions favouring the land value based. However, there was 600 to 640 actually in favour of change of some sort. We provided two options with change. So whilst they were 300 to 320 each, the weight of the submissions does favour change. What this amendment does is actually a gentler process than what the Mayor had proposed, because it's 16.6% and then 33% in year 2. It's smoothing it over the next 2 years so that people can be aware of what that might mean for them, and if they can prepare for that in some way, it gives them a bit more time. So I do think this is appropriate, and this is more moderate, I believe, than the original option.
Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to the Move and Seconder for putting this. I think it's really important we have this 50-50 debate in this space, given it is something that submitters have commented on, so I appreciate you for bringing this up. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I probably came onto council with a firm view that capital value was the best way to go, and the more I read about it and the more submissions I hear, the less sure I am really of anything in this space. As the Mayor said, none of the options are particularly good. I just want to talk a little bit about the submissions we have received. So we had around 430 in favour of land and 300 or so for the other two. So what does that work out to? About 42% of our community supported land value, 29% hybrid, 29% capital value. So you could say, well, if you combine hybrid and capital, well, 58% of people favoured change. You could also say, if you combined land and hybrid, that 71% of the community advocated for a system that had land as the primary way in which we base our rates off. So I think it's, there's a truth in there between those two, but I think it is fair to say a lot of our community are in favour of land, or a majority land, as our way of basing our rating system, 71%. The one thing I'd say that came through to me clearly in submissions is the absolutist arguments on either side, that we are evil if we move to a capital system, or that we are evil if we stick with a land value system. And the interesting thing about those absolutist arguments really proves to me that we're not going to know until we do something. At the end of the day, although we've had a great engagement in this process, we've had a lot of submissions, as Councillor Bowen did highlight at the start, there's a lot of our community who really don't follow what we're doing and don't know what we're doing and won't see this change until it comes through in their rates bill next year. And so, on balance, I actually prefer the wording of the Mayor and Councillor Harper's recommendation, because what it says, and if we take a scientific approach, as we were discussing earlier today, let's make the shift to 70-30 and then review in 3 years' time, once we've seen the community reaction to that change, what the impact will be. I'm not against 50-50, and if I'm still here in 3 years' time, I quite possibly will support at that review moving to 50-50, but I would rather than committing ourselves to overextend to 50-50 now, we move to 70-30 and then in 3 years' time undertake that review. So I'm not asking for us to wait an awful lot longer than the councillors here are suggesting. I'm saying rather than moving 50-50 in year 3, let's wait and in 3 years' time review, and then we can move to it in year 4, if that's been the reaction we've seen from the community. So I hope that's a sort of balanced perspective of where I'm coming from. I appreciate council putting it up, and I accept if this is what gets through, but I would prefer we made a change, made a call, gave our community some certainty for the next 3 years, and then reviewed the impact it would have. I would say one argument that came up, apologies before I finish, from the submissions that I hadn't thought of before was the wealth versus disposable income argument, which I thought was really interesting, is that often, of course, capital value is seen as a indicator of the wealth of an individual. The argument was put by a submitter that, well, yes, somebody might be on a small subdivided section with a new home, that if they've just built a new home, they're likely to have a massive mortgage that they're paying for that property, whereas somebody who's been on their property for 30 years and has paid their mortgage off might not, will quite possibly not be paying a mortgage. So actually, although the wealth of that new property is higher, the disposable income's lower, and although the wealth of that land value property is lower, the disposable income might be higher. So I thought it was interesting as a proxy, rather than just talking about the capital values in total, to think about it from a disposable income perspective, and that although you might be in a newer home and you might be in a more expensive home, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got more money that you can pay on your rate. So I don't know what way that pushes it. I just thought it was interesting. There's something I hadn't thought of before. And around land value, I think I fully encourage large and subdividable sections to be subdivided, and I think properties that have a significant amount of land in the middle of the city having high rates, I think that's perfectly appropriate. That's what our system's designed to do, and that's what we want to encourage, as is stated through our plans, is encouraging brownfield development and subdivision. So the argument that, well, we should change the system because there's people who've got large sections in town who are paying high rates, I personally think is quite a weak one, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to encourage. So I've sort of tempered that into why I'm sitting at 70-30 as a better option to look at for now.
Councillor McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to actually speak on this. Initially, I'd actually supported the 30-70 split because I think it was fair and that sort of thing. But I am going to actually support this amendment because I think that if we really want to see the real impacts on the ground and really assess the impact of this rating value or review, we actually have to go 50-50. And the reason why I think like this is simply because of the information that we've been provided, not only by officers, but also the many views that have been expressed by the community at large. And it is safe to say that based on all the information that have been provided to us and all the arguments that have been expressed to us, there's no clear winner in, when it comes to both rating systems. When we move to capital value, we also see the rating impact or the effect that it's having on commercial business and that sort of thing. And also, when we move to land value, those are bigger sections, and tiny houses, for example, pay more, or it's unfair for some of them. And there's no system has monopoly over the other, from what we've seen from the discussion or the research that's been presented, or the expression or the submission that have been expressed to us by the community. There are advantages and disadvantages by both systems. And this is why, by going 50-50, we're actually getting the best of both worlds, and as Councillor Dinson put it, and the worst of both worlds as well. And 2 or 3 years from, or 4 years from now, if I'm still here, or, we can still review this thing. Underpinning my decision today is largely around the idea or the notion of fairness. My colleagues or councillors would have heard me asking a lot of our residents who came to submit or present to us what was the conception or what was the idea of fairness. And a lot of them told me it was the ability to pay. And personally for me, I think this amendment is therefore a reasonable compromise. And if we want to see a real material change, and I think this is the way to go. And as some of my fellow councillors already said, staging it in equal steps for the next 3 years is actually a sensible way to do this. It's actually a safe way to do this and a cleaner way to do this. There have been arguments around not many, this has been untested and this has not been tested before. 72% of councils around the country use capital value. And I reject the notion, not that I don't take into consideration the many views expressed by commercial or business communities who have actually expressed some concerns of what this change will potentially have on their commercial properties. But 72% of councils around the nation actually use capital value. And I've not heard of any businesses running away, packing their bags, because the majority of councils around the nation have actually moved to capital value. This is a sensible compromise. And if we really want to allay or alleviate some of the concerns that have been raised by the business community, I'm sure we have a number of levers to use, for example. Like Councillor Denson mentioned, in differentials, we have some levers that we can do, sort of pull or change, move around to sort of alleviate the concerns that have been expressed by the business community. But I think my personal view that based on the submissions that I've heard and underpinned by the idea of fairness and the notion of fairness that has been expressed by some of our submitters, that this is, I think, a fairer, sensible, and cleaner way of doing this rather than the 70 or 30-70% divide that was presented to us initially. And I think, just to reiterate, that it's legal. We consulted on this, on a hybrid model, and it's legal, 50-50. And I encourage my colleagues to actually support this because it's fair and sensible. Thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Colleagues, I will be supporting the amendment in front of us. Thank you for all of your comments in this debate, and I agree with Councillor Wood, said the further we get into this, the less certain I am of anything, but where we are today, I absolutely agree with the comments made by Councillor Zabellin about the ideology that we bring to this process and balancing those competing priorities for our community. I think 50-50 seems to be the fairest way to do that. I'm comfortable with, if we go with 50-50, staging that over time. We signalled in our consultation that any move towards capital value would probably need to be staged, so that shouldn't come as a surprise to our community. But I think in considering the submissions, I was actually surprised by how spread those submissions were on the three options that we put to them. I was expecting a much larger preference for status quo, because that's the cognitive bias we all bring to these discussions, that status quo feels easier, it's what we know, it's certain, it's expected, there's no change. So I expected there to be a much stronger support for land value than we actually saw. And the fact that that was so balanced, I think, does say to me that our community is ready for us to start this change process. This is just a start. The three equal steps set out in this amendment does provide the certainty to our community, residential and business, that you mentioned, Mr. Mayor. This would give certainty for decision making. People would know what was coming over the next 3 years in the same way as the original recommendation gave certainty. So I don't find this causes any kind of confusion. So on that basis, happy to support the amendment and grateful to colleagues for bringing it forward.
Right, a reply. Oh.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Sorry to get in the queue late. I've really struggled with this, I have to say, given that I don't really support either of these options, as you all know. I really strongly feel that full capital value would be a better system for the city. Not because it's necessarily an ideal system, but just on balance, I think it achieves a fairer outcome. However, neither of these are putting up full capital value. And so then I'm faced with the decision, is it better to have 30% capital value in year one, which gives some relief to those householders who are paying very large rates and have been doing for very many years, or is it better to achieve a bigger percentage of capital value after 3 years? And then the other thing that's in my mind, of course, is that none of this is certain. Because as you will all recall, a couple of years ago, we all agreed that capital value was the best system, but we seem to have changed our minds on that. So having something changing every year, I'm not a total fan of that, I have to say, because I think it's hard enough for people to get their heads around rates increases without having a change every year. And also, there'll be a new council elected in that time. Will they want to continue the change? Who knows? It also cuts across a valuation year. So those are the things that I kind of have as doubts in my mind about 50-50. Then on the other hand, 70-30 is really effectively very little change, because the 30% capital value still takes into account improvements and land. So in actual fact, the amount that's being based just on improvements is very, very small percentage. So this has been a difficult one, and as colleagues will know, I've discussed this with over the last few days, I find myself in a difficult position. I think on balance, I'm going to go for the 50-50 option, just because it achieves, ultimately, if it's carried through, it achieves a better balance in my mind. But it's not, neither of them are options that I particularly love, I have to say.
Right, a reply.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, colleagues. And firstly, thanks to the community and the many members of the community that did weigh in on it. And it was really interesting hearing from colleagues their various perspectives on kind of what stood out for them in those submissions, and certainly reflecting again on what came through, for me as well. And I think, what we've consistently heard has been well reflected in the debate around the table, which leaves me still with the view that the right way forward is a bit further and a bit slower, and starting in year one to provide a bit of relief in the community where it's needed most, and to see that evolve over time. I would push back on the notion that this somehow creates uncertainty. I think we're actually giving a very clear direction over 3 years and sending a broad signal around direction of travel. So I think that that's a very consistent signal that all members of the community, business and otherwise, can work with. I'd also push back on the notion that somehow this is an immoderate kind of thing, or has any sort of hidden consequences. And it's actually it's an extremely moderate approach, to be honest, and it's one that will serve the community well over time, and it's one that I've of recent times become increasingly comfortable with when I've heard directly from members of the community around the impact, and thinking about making sure that we do phase it in over time to a system that is fair, because it does better reflect the buying power of the constituent, the extent to which they can afford to pay. And again, would remind, I know there's been some commentary around the business community and how this might affect in there and around inbound investment and those kind of things. A substantial majority of the commercial industrial component of our property portfolio within the city would actually be better off. A substantial majority of the business community actually better off on this. Yes, a few of the largest entities with the deepest pockets that often see a whole lot of those profits go offshore will need to contribute a little bit more. I'm prepared to go in that direction. I think it's perfectly reasonable, and as a way to give most businesses in this community a bit of relief at a time when we would agree that that's a good way forward. I will probably wrap up there, Mr. Mayor and colleagues, and again thank everyone for their input, and would actually acknowledge Councillor Johnson for bringing this to us quite early on in her tenure, in fact before her tenure on council. And I think that's probably my final reflection, is that it's taken us as a council 8 years, to get here. And that's after years and years of advocacy before. So I think it is a point in a very long journey indeed, and one that we would do well to see through for the benefit of our community, a bit slower, a bit further. I wanted to ask all colleagues for their support in this. Thank you.
All right, councillors, we will vote, please, on the amendment. And that is passed, 12 votes for and 4 against. All right, we'll go to the substantive, which will include the amendment. We can just alter that, please. You'd be better to copy the. Okay, that council assumes the hybrid rate option of 50% land value and 50% capital value in 3 equal steps for the next 3 years. I'm sorry, colleagues, I'm not going to move that, so if we can have somebody that can move that, Councillor Barrett and Councillor Dennison. All right. Do you want to speak to this? No. All right. I just will say something, and I realise we've got a tough day. There's a couple of comments. The industrial and commercial sector will not have a significant benefit. And for someone who actually is in that space, yes, we've had a couple of big retail commercial operators here that might have some benefit, but to Tanganui, and just about every commercial operator in town will see some significant increases. So, unforeseen consequences, colleagues, but I'm sorry I can't agree with this. And anyway, it is what it is. Councillor Dennison.
Wasn't going to speak, but I feel like I need to. I think this, to acknowledge, this will be a milestone moment for our city to make a step change from our rating base. And that's one thing, so I want to give that significance. Secondly, this will not create one further cent of rates from what we strike. It's actually a way of how it's distributed. And in the past, you might argue that some are paid disproportionately more and maybe unfairly more than others, while others have had the benefit. And so when we're talking about benefit and consequences and unintended and otherwise, I actually just think it's just a little bit of motive in the respect, because actually around the fairness argument, it's around a principle approach. And ultimately, if you don't believe that capital has some merit, well then you're in the land value camp. Because each one of these two proposals were moving in a hybrid fashion to test the waters if you wanted to. So I think overall, there's a high level of comfort around moving towards capital value, and I think this is just the mode of how we shift. And so I just want to keep it quite simplistic, but I also want to re-emphasise the significance of this decision today. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess I will treat this as right of reply unless there's anybody else coming in. Wasn't going to speak either, but did just really need to clarify around statements and around the business community and that end of the community and the rates that they will be contributing. So the analysis that I've seen, and I'm quite comfortable with, demonstrates conclusively that most businesses in this community will receive a rates reduction through a transition to capital value. It also does so that a small number, and quite a small number of businesses, the very large ones, will absorb a bit more. And that's the simple facts of the matter. And for those larger businesses, I would have the view, and I would hope that colleagues continue to have the view, that that is simply the cost of doing business in New Zealand. It's that way across most, if not all, cities, and in reality, we should be in that space rather than holding out an unsustainable discount for those very few large entities that can well afford to pay, and thereby forcing those who have very little ability to pay, some of those in our most vulnerable communities and least socioeconomically privileged communities, forcing that cost onto them. If we're going to shift cost, I'm always prepared to make sure that we give a bit of relief where it is needed most, and that is in the parts of our community where the social inequities and economic inequities have hit hardest for the longest. So thank colleagues again for their support on this and look forward to the vote.
We will vote. And that has passed 13 votes for and 3 against. All right. We now go to the rural rate. And again, I've put something up that was reflective of submissions that I heard around council changing the discounted differential rural rate from 37% over a 2-year period by reducing to 30% in year 1 and then 25% in year 2. And that's moved by myself, seconded by, you're still prepared to? Good, thank you, Councillor Zabellan. Look, councillors, we're going to be a little bit more joined up on this. This is what we heard a lot from a lot of first-timers and that came, first-time submitters that came to the chamber and submitted as part of our 1,400-odd submissions. They couldn't understand why we were doing this. And I'd have to say we probably didn't do a fantastic job of explaining the differential that, one, already existed, and two, why it needed to change, and actually what they did get in belonging to city services. Yes, they don't get footpaths, they don't get majority of them look after their vast majority look after their own wastewater, and vast majority after their own water. So, as other cities, and this argument's been used just in the last debate around being very similar to other cities, we had one of the highest differentials reductions in the country. So to get some sort of level of parity, I believe it needs to be done over a staged period. It is actually quite a lot to, even though they are paying less, they would have quite a significant rate increase. And again, the argument that's just been used before around fairness, I don't think that is very fair. So I'd hope you'd support something that is more balanced and above all fair. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just before I speak, I just wondered if you'd had an indication from officers of any financial impact of doing this, or
I haven't gone to the officers direct around the actual numbers, but the numbers are actually relatively small. I'm looking at you, Cam, in terms of numbers. This affects 1 point something million.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, and Steve Pearson may want to jump in, but we did try to articulate, I guess, at the various levels of discount in the attachment to the report as to what the impact that puts back on the residential ratepayer. And the numbers are relatively low because the residential ratepayers is a lot larger number of them, but it has a bigger impact in terms of on those in the what we'd call rural medium or lifestylers, in terms of the benefit they would receive in terms of the phasing of that in.
Thanks. I'll just have a comment then, if I may. I'm happy to support this. I think it's a response to the weight of submissions that we had from people in this affected group that reducing the discount down in one step was too much for them to cope with in 1 year. And I think, on balance, although we want to end up in a situation where the discount is reduced, I think it's preferable to do it in a staged approach, so that people have an opportunity to adjust their budgets and to understand, with some certainty what their bills are going to be coming up. So I'm happy to support this, and I think it's a sensible response to submissions received.
Councillor Zabellan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm very happy to second this. I think this is a relatively small group of properties, about 1,700 or so, that are impacted, but they are all highly impacted all at once, especially by the combo of a change to a hybrid system and the reduction in the discount or the differential comparative to urban residential properties. And I agree with the Mayor that we didn't go out for consultation with a great deal of justification or reasoning or evidence for the quantum that we arrived at, and that did result in a fair amount of outrage but also some misconception about the discount and rates generally. So I think there are many arguments for and against a discount. I've had some really great discussions in the rural community about this, but this isn't really about those arguments. This is about the need to ease the impact of significant increases to certain subsets, if we can. So I'm very happy, would seek your support on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, councillors. I think really this is, and some of those arguments of why are we doing this, well, our costs as a council have gone up significantly, and the existing discounted or differential rate there needed to change, and it's probably something that we should have done some time ago, actually. So there'll be some that say, look, what are we getting for our money? Well, it's democracy and you belong to a city. And also there is city services, the roading networks, and we have a sealed network, or mostly sealed network. We have very, very few gravel roads within the city boundary. There's also access to all of our amenities and libraries, etc., etc. So it is, but the big thing is being you are part of a democracy and part of a city. So as hard as it is, we do have to do this, but at least it is over. It's less than what we initially went out with 17% in one hit. It's to 25%, and it's over 2 years, and that hopefully will give people some level of comfort over 2 years. So I ask you to support it, please. We'll vote. And that's passed 16 votes for and none against. All right, we now need to go to recommendations 2A and 2B, and this is around that the council instruct Chief Executive prepare a draft of the final LTP for consideration by council. Then it incorporates the following: A, changes to assumptions and budgets set out in sections 5.2 to 5.5, and then carry forwards of incomplete capital programs as set out in sections 5.6 and attachment 3. Do the officers just want to speak to this first in a summarised manner?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm okay with not commenting too much, because I think earlier on I outlined the reasons for particularly 2A as to what was driving those change in assumptions. I don't need to repeat that.
Okay, thank you. All right, and set out in section 5.6, I'm just going to that now. Yes, you can ask questions. Deputy Mayor.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Mayor. Actually, it's not a comment, it's just a question. Just with regards to page 128 and the current Better Off funding projects, I notice that the Rangitane Better Off funding resource is proposed to be reallocated, and in that section it says no. Can I ask why?
We're just doing 2A and 2B at this stage.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's just 2A and 2B, and it's attachment 3. If you go to attachment 3, page 127 and 126 and 127, it explains what is happening there. So in terms of value of carry forwards, just high level numbers, please.
Through Mr. Mayor, just under 7 million in total. Just to clarify, so we've been really careful about carry forwards this year. The team have been pushed really, really hard. There's been a number of things that we have said we won't carry forward, and we'll just take that as a saving because, you know, we can do that. So this is just stuff that has got a sort of legitimate, you know, mostly in train, and just there's some legitimate reason that it's just not going to get finished by the end of the year. So in terms of the impact on the team in terms of delivering this stuff next year instead of this year, it's we assess it as fairly minimal because most of it's in train now.
Okay. And in terms of completion of capital and renewals, what are we sitting at?
We're still at the end of the quarter. We were still looking like in the low 90s%.
Okay.
So that is also accounting for things that, you know, we've taken out of the budget or we've made decisions around. So we're sort of netting that out.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thanks. Just looking at table 3 on the top of page 78 with the total capital breakdown for each year. So am I correct in assuming that those carry forwards now are included in the total there? Or not?
Through the mayor, yes.
They're included. So that 6.9 million is included. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of questions. The camper van dump stations, programme 1535, that's been on the books for ages, and we don't seem to have made much progress with it. What's the hold up there?
So you'll recall that we had a site identified at the domain, and that got sort of soundly rejected by the community. So we've been looking for an alternative site. We have one that we have actually got one now that we think will be acceptable, but we're just going to work it through. But we just have run out of time to get it done this year.
Okay. And then programme 1459, social housing, additional social housing units. The only additional social housing that I'm aware of that we've got planned is at Summer Haze. There's a proposal to defer that Summer Haze budget out, I think, to year 3. So how have we got budgets of $500,000 in year 1 and year 2 for additional social housing units? What's that for?
I'll get Bryce to answer
that. Bryce Hosking, Group Manager, Property and Resource Recovery. Just a bit of a restructuring of the budget as a result of that Summer Haze decision and the investigation around CCO models, and so the $500,000 rather than carrying it all forward into year 3, leaving a provision out of the existing budget, so they haven't changed at all as an overall envelope, but just restructuring them around. So if we need to be doing a bit of work towards design and some of that work alongside that from a Summer Haze perspective, we've got some budget there.
Okay, so that's still directed towards the Summer Haze project?
It is at the moment, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just in regards to the parking infringement revenue, which is 5.4, it's proposed an extra 500,000, and notwithstanding it got reported in the April meeting. Can I get some comments on what the current revenue has been in recent years? I thought it was more under 2 million, but can I just understand the 500,000 increase in the assumption?
Yeah, so when we pulled the draft budget together, we had the figure much lower. Through the current year, our collection rates are actually much higher of that infringement revenue. The proposed budget without that 500,000 would actually be less than the current year's revenue stream. So the increase is actually taking us to a slightly higher assumption, and that's the large reason behind that 500,000. It's putting us above the current year's trajectory for end of financial year.
And is that staying, that revenue, does that stay in the activity, or does that just go to our bottom line overall?
It stays within the activity and it reduces rates because we know we're going to get that revenue.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Harper.
Thank you. Just 2 questions. One's around the Amberley Ave Bridge the 1.4 million. So is that a delay in that project, or is that on target?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. It's really, not really a delay. It was probably when we initially scoped the project and tried to identify what we would do this year and what would be, there's always some that was going to be done in the next financial year. We were probably a little bit optimistic about what we would get done. So, yeah, so that's just basically getting the budgets in the right years.
Okay. Second question is, I see there's nothing in here for Featherston Street. Should there be anything in here for fixing up Featherston Street?
No. So we're still, well, I suppose it depends on, so we've got the paper coming next week, so out of that, that will sort of, I suppose, determine if there's any money in next year. But the most, because 90% of the money that we're spending on Featherston Street is coming from NZTA, and that we can't carry any of that forward because that's got a hard deadline of the end of June to have it spent by, otherwise it vanishes.
But if there's anything that needs to happen to rectify Featherston Street, shouldn't that be a carry forward, or?
Well, we haven't made that decision yet.
Okay.
So yeah, subject to any decision still to be made. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, no more questions. Thanks for that. Okay, so we've got 2A and 2B. That Council instruct the Chief Executive to prepare a draft of the final LTP for consideration by Council incorporates the following: changes to assumptions and budgets as set out in sections 5.2 to 5.5, and carry forwards of incomplete capital programs as set out in section 5.6 and attachment 3. I'm happy to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Just want to acknowledge staff and around the completion rate of what we're doing. It's significantly better than where we've been previously, and ensure, Chris, that it keeps going. All right, Councillor Bowen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, great minds think alike. I did just think that was worthy of commenting on the capital work on track to deliver the highest completion rate in council history. That's a huge improvement. It's one that we've been asking for around these table over many years. I'm absolutely delighted to see us get there. Really, really delighted that the list of carry forwards is so short. You know, in previous terms, we've had pages and pages of carry forwards, and this just shows, I mean, a very real, tangible way, the progress that we've been making in our capital programme. So thanks to the staff for that.
Great. All right, we will vote. That has passed 16 votes for, none against. Okay. All right, colleagues, we'll break there, and we'll be back in the chamber at 1:15. Thank you.